This audio is recorded by John Loth. It's intended for educational purposes. If you find value in these works, and if you'd like to assist me in the production of these recordings, head over to my website where you can donate as little as $1 to help me continue making these. I really appreciate all your help. Thanks for having a look and a listen. Your friend, John Loth. Between Two Ages by Zbigniew Brzezinski. Chapter 5. America and the World. America's relationship with the world must reflect American domestic values and preoccupations. A profound discrepancy between the external conduct of a democratic society and its internal norms is no longer possible. Mass communications quickly expose the gulf and undercut the support needed for its foreign policy. Just as a nation preoccupied with the communist threat at home can conduct a vigorously anti-communist policy abroad, or a nation fearful of revolution can become intensely involved in counter-revolutionary activity, so a nation concerned with social justice and technological adaptation cannot help but become similarly committed on an international level. In his second treatise on government, John Locke wrote, "In the beginning, all the world was America. Today, all the world is America, in the sense that America is the first to experience the social, psychological, political, and ideological dilemmas produced by man's sudden acquisition of altogether unprecedented power over his environment and over himself. The Third American Revolution, occurring in an era of volatile beliefs and of rapidly spreading technological change, thus clearly dictates America's role, that of the social innovator, exploiting science in the service of man, but without dogmatically prescribing the destiny of man. The success of America in building a healthy democratic society would hold promise for a world still dominated by ideological and racial conflicts, by economic and social injustice. America's failure not only would be a setback for trends underway since the great revolutions of the late 18th century, but could signify a more fundamental human failure: man's inability to overcome his baser instincts and his capitulation before the complexity and power of science. Part 1. The American Future. If the problems that confront America were neither recognized nor anticipated, the inherent dangers would be even greater. Such is not the case. Contemporary America is perhaps more candidly critical and more demanding of itself than any other society. National reports pinpointing the society's failures, devastating critiques of national shortcomings, elaborate efforts at social stock-taking, all reflect a more introspective and deliberately sober national mood. Studies of the future, organized on a large scale, both by special academic commissions and by well-endowed private institutes, indicate mounting national recognition that the future can and must be planned, that unless there is a modicum of deliberate choice, change will result in chaos. This does not guarantee that a national response will actually be mounted, but it does indicate a more pervasive awareness among leading sectors of society of the need for a deliberate response. The historical vitality of the United States system derives from the deeply rooted commitment of the American people to the idea of democratic change. The American tradition of free dialogue and of hierarchically unfettered expression of disagreement has been an important factor in developing this responsiveness to change. It has made it possible to exploit protest movements and thereby render them historically superfluous by adapting and adopting their programs. This is to deny neither the element of violence in American history nor the oft-noted conservatism of the electorate. Nevertheless, The fundamental reality of American life has been the assimilation of the rapid change induced by the frontier, by immigration, and by industrial growth. A dynamic socioeconomic reality has blended with a certain political conservatism and created a pluralist socio-political system that has in the past proven itself to be remarkably resilient in absorbing extraordinary change. It possesses a structural quality capable of generating and deciphering warning signals of mounting social stress. Today's America has set higher standards for itself than has any other society. It aims at creating racial harmony on the basis of equality, at achieving social welfare while preserving personal liberty, at eliminating poverty without shackling individual freedom. Tensions in the United States might be less were it to seek less, but in its ambitious goals, America retains its innovative character. Though the new left, and particularly the violent left, has temporarily served to fortify socially conservative or even reactionary trends, the impatience of the young is more and more likely to permeate the socio-political system, especially as they begin to occupy more influential positions and make it more responsive to the need for change and reform. Moreover, the increasingly international experience of the American intellectual and business elite has already prompted a greater inclination to consider contemporary problems within a larger framework, thereby drawing lessons for the United States from both the political evolution and the social innovation of other advanced countries. As a result, more Americans recognize that the two broad areas of needed and, it is to be hoped, developing change involve the institutional and the cultural aspects of American society. The former, largely, though not exclusively, pertains to the political sphere, the latter to the educational domain, particularly as it concerns the content and the shaping of national values. More deliberate change in both realms would serve as a catalyst for reform in other areas of national life, providing both the framework and the motivation for the timely adoption of needed remedies. Participatory pluralism. The approaching 200th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence could justify the call for a national constitutional convention to re-examine the nation's formal institutional framework, either 1976 or 1989. The 200th anniversary of the Constitution could serve as a suitable target date for culminating a national dialogue and the relevance of existing arrangements, the workings of the representative process, and the desirability of imitating the various European regionalization reforms and of streamlining the administrative structure. More important still, either date would provide a suitable occasion for redefining the meaning of a modern democracy, a task admittedly challenging but not necessarily more so than when it was undertaken by the Founding Fathers, and for setting ambitious and concrete social goals. Realism, however, forces us to recognize that the necessary political innovation will not come from direct constitutional reform, desirable as that would be. The needed change is more likely to develop incrementally and less overtly. Nonetheless, its eventual scope may be far-reaching, especially as the political process gradually assimilates scientific, technological change. Thus, in the political sphere, the increased flow of information and the development of more efficient techniques of coordination may make possible greater de-evolution of authority and responsibility in the lower levels of government and society. In the past, the division of power has traditionally caused problems of inefficiency, poor coordination, and dispersal of authority. But today, the new communications and computation techniques make possible both increased authority at the lower levels and almost instant national coordination. The rapid transferal of information, combined with highly advanced analytical methods, would also make possible broad national planning. In the looser French sense of target definition, not only concentrating on economic goals, but more clearly defining ecological and cultural objectives. Technological development makes it certain that modern society will require more and more planning. Deliberate management of the American future will become widespread, with the planner eventually displacing the lawyer as the key social legislator and manipulator. This will put a great emphasis on defining goals and, by the same token, on a more self-conscious preoccupation with social ends. How to combine social planning with personal freedom is already emerging as the key dilemma of technotronic America, replacing the industrial age's preoccupation with balancing social needs against requirements of free enterprise. The strengthening of local, especially metropolitan, government is already recognized as an urgent necessity for the democratic process in the United States. The de-evolution of financial responsibility to lower echelons of the political system may encourage both the flow of better talent and greater local participation in more important local decision-making. National coordination and local participation could thus be wedded by new systems of coordination. This has already been tried successfully by some large businesses. The trend toward more coordination but less centralization would be in keeping with the American tradition of blurring sharp distinctions between public and private institutions. Institutions such as TVA or the Ford Foundation perform functions difficult for many Europeans to understand, since they are more accustomed either to differentiate sharply between the public sphere and the private, as has been typical of the industrial age, or to subordinate the private to the public, as is favored by the socialists and some liberals, or to absorb the private by the public, as has been the case in communist states. At one time, the question of ownership was the decisive social and political issue of a society undergoing modernization. The forms of land ownership, customary in the feudal agricultural age, were extended through force of habit, as well as historical accommodation, into the industrial age. Owning a factory was seen as being largely the same as owning a piece of land. This eventually led to a severe conflict between old forms and modes of evaluating individual rights and the new requirements of industrial organization, of collective employee rights, and of changed socio-political institutions. Socialism was one extreme solution. In the more advanced West, depersonalized corporate ownership and the limited sharing of authority with organized labor was the general pattern of accommodation. The question of ownership was thus redefined into one of control and regulation, while the issue of exploitation associated with ownership was replaced by new problems concerning the economic participation and psychological well-being of the employed. In the process, even in America, the federal government emerged as the key institution for restructuring social relations, and the question of the extent of the state's role in economic affairs became crucial. Unlike the agricultural age, during which few state institutions were involved in organizing and assisting man's daily existence, the industrial age produced both greater opportunities for national direction and a greater social demand for government-imposed social justice. More centralized direction by the state seemed the only alternative to chaos and the only response to social injustice. Our age has been moving toward a new pattern, blurring distinctions between public and private bodies and encouraging more cross-participation in both by their employees and members. In Europe, co-determination not only has involved profit sharing, but has increasingly led to participation in policy making. Pressures in the same direction are clearly building up in the United States as well. At the same time, the widening social perspectives of the American business community are likely to increase the involvement of business executives in social problems, thereby merging private and public activity on both the local and the national levels. This might in turn make for more effective social application of the new management techniques, which, unlike bureaucratized governmental procedures, have proved both efficient and responsive to external stimuli. Such participatory pluralism may prove reasonably effective in subordinating science and technology to social ends. In the past, for some, the introduction of the machine was the beginning of utopia. For others, it meant the unleashing of evil. Similarly, today technology is seen by some modern conservatives as the beginning of a happy new age because it promises to free man from many social problems, while for the new left, technotronics is replacing property as the symbol of social evil. Yet the crucial issue remains: the ends to which science and technology are applied, and a society in which effective coordination is combined with decentralization is more likely to crystallize the necessary discussion and reflection. Scientific expertise can then be mobilized for social ends without granting scientists a dominating political role because of their scientific credentials. Participatory pluralism will automatically ensure neither political wisdom nor social responsibility, but it might make for a society that more nearly approaches both. Anticipation of the social effects of technological innovation offers a good example of the necessary forms of cross-institutional cooperation. One of the nation's most urgent needs is the creation of a variety of mechanisms that link national and local governments, academia, and the business community. There, the example of NASA may be especially rewarding. In the task of evaluating not only the operational effects of the new technologies, but their cultural and psychological effects. A series of national and local councils, not restricted to scientists but made up of various social groups, including the clergy, would be in keeping with both the need and the emerging pattern of social response to change. The trend toward the progressive breakdown of sharp distinctions between the political and social spheres, between public and private institutions, will not lend itself to easy clarification as liberal, conservative, or socialist. All terms derived from a different historical context. But it will be a major step toward the participatory democracy advocated by some of the New Left in the late 1960s. Ironically, this participatory democracy is likely to emerge through a progressive symbiosis of the institutions of society and of government, rather than through the remedies the New Left had been advocating: economic expropriation and political revolution, both distinctly anachronistic remedies of the earlier industrial era. The evolutionary emergence of participatory pluralism may not seem a sufficient response to those sectors of American society that have become entirely alienated, and it may appear as too much change to those who have a vested interest in the status quo. But for that large body of Americans who accept the concept of gradual change and who will value procedural order, multiple patterns of social involvement could provide the desired creative outlet for a society that is increasingly becoming more complex and expert-oriented. In that setting, it is even possible that the political parties as traditionally known in America will further decline in importance. In their stead, organized local, regional, urban, professional, and other interests will provide the focus for political action, and shifting national coalitions will form on an ad hoc basis around specific issues of national import. In the immediate future, the politics of street protest are likely to dominate the visible dimensions of American political life. Less visible, indeed sometimes totally obscured by the prevailing rhetoric about the repressive society, is the gradual progress toward a new democracy increasingly based on participatory pluralism in many areas of life. Assuming that short-term crises do not deflect the United States from redefining the substance of its democratic tradition, The long-range effect of the present transition and its turmoils will be to deepen and widen the scope of the democratic process in America. Change in cultural formation. The evolutionary development of American democracy will have to be matched by changes in the processes of forming and shaping the content of its national culture. As in the case of political change, cultural reform is more likely to come about through evolution, in part deliberately encouraged and in part stimulated by overall social change, than through programmatic engineering. The element of deliberate and conscious choice may be even more important here than in the transformation of complex institutional arrangements, because in modern society, the educational system and the mass media have become the principal social means for defining the substance of a national culture. This is particularly true in American society, which has downgraded such alternative sources of culture as churches and traditional customs. The educational system has a special social responsibility in regard to Black Americans. Here, the simultaneous needs are to enhance the Black citizen's dignity and to enlarge his long-range opportunities. These needs have occasionally clashed, but perhaps the short-term remedy will be to combine the Black American's quest for his separate identity through such institutional devices as separate courses and residences, with massive and scientifically oriented remedial training. The challenge today, and probably for several decades to come, is to help the Black American skip the late industrial stage of America's development, and this cannot be done unless sensitivity to his psychological needs is matched by a recognition of the necessity for disciplined, focused intellectual effort. The two will be hard to combine, but it is in this area that eventual progress or disaster in America's race relations will be shaped. Racial calamity will be avoided only if society at large defines more clearly the values it seeks, is willing to create a responsive framework to promote them, and is prepared to insist on respect for orderly procedure. Nothing can be more destructive than wide swings from permissive and guilt-ridden acquiescence to any demand made by Black extremists. Such acquiescence merely stimulates an escalation of extremism, to insensitive passivity or opposition to Black demands for a fair share of participation in American society. A massive educational effort is the crucial factor, but to be successful, it must be geared to the long-range thrust of American society's developmental needs. The unprecedented spread of mass education in America raises the more general question whether mechanically extending the duration of education will suffice to meet both the psychological and technical needs of the emerging society. The social scope and duration of current mass education differs from the early industrial emphasis on minimum mass literacy for males and from the even more elitist medieval pattern of very limited learning for very few. Contemporary programs aim at the education of a high portion of both sexes and call for periods of schooling lasting anywhere from 10 to almost 20 years, in the case of more advanced degrees. In America, higher education is carried on within a relatively self-contained organizational and even social framework, making for a protracted period of semi-isolation from problems of social reality. As a result, both organizationally and in terms of content, a divorce between education and social existence has tended to develop, leading to the already noted emotional and psychic manifestations of student frustration and immaturity. By extending education on an intermittent basis throughout the lifetime of the citizen, society would go a long way toward meeting this problem. The duration of the self-contained and relatively isolated phase of initial education could then be shortened. Taking into account the earlier physical and sexual maturation of young people today, it could be more generally pursued within a work-study framework, and it should be supplemented by periodic additional training throughout most of one's active life. A good case can be made for ending initial education, more of which could be obtained in the home through electronic devices, somewhere around the age of 18. This formal initial period could be followed by 2 years of service in a socially desirable cause, then by direct involvement in some professional activity, and by advanced systematic training within that area, and finally by regular periods of 1 and eventually even 2 years of broadening, integrative study at the beginning of every decade of one's life, somewhere up to the age of 60. For example, medical or legal training could begin after only 2 years of college, thus both shortening the time needed to complete the training and probably also increasing the number attracted into these professions. Regular and formal required retraining, as well as broadening, could ensue at regular intervals throughout most of one's professional career. Combining initial specialization with a subsequent broadening of philosophical and scientific horizons would somewhat counteract the present trend which makes increased specialization and rising professional standing go hand in hand. This encourages a narrowness of general outlook. The trend could be gradually reversed by a situation in which specialization at the age of greatest absorptive capability would be followed by more intellectual integration at a stage of increased personal maturity. Such an approach would encourage the gradual emergence of an integrative, modernizing elite that would show greater concern with society's underlying humane values in an age in which intensive scientific specialization is fraught with dangers of intellectual fragmentation. The formal educational system has been relatively slow in exploiting the new opportunities for supplementary home-based education through television consoles and other electronic devices. It has also been suspicious of the growing inclination of non-governmental organizations to develop their own learning and training programs. In different ways, however, both the Black community and business are becoming more involved in education, for psychological as well as for professional reasons. Greater multiplicity in educational training will make for a more pluralistic national community, and the increasing involvement of business companies in education may lead to a more rapid adaptation of the latest techniques and scientific knowledge to the educational process. American business, and, to a lesser extent, the government, have already undertaken extensive programs of managerial retooling and retraining, thereby moving toward the intermittent educational pattern. Change in educational processes. Change in educational procedures and philosophy should also be accompanied by parallel changes in the broader national processes by which values are generated and disseminated. Given America's role as a world disseminator of new values and techniques, this is both a national and a global obligation. Yet no other country has permitted its mass culture, taste, daily amusement, and most important, the indirect education of its children to be almost exclusively the domain of private business and advertising, or permitted both standards of taste and the intellectual content of culture to be defined largely by a small group of entrepreneurs located in one metropolitan center. American television, in which a cultural monopoly is exercised by a relatively small group, reflects the insensitivity of the communications process to the tastes and philosophical values of much of America. Rising public dissatisfaction with this state of affairs indicates that perhaps some change has to come in this field as well. The geographical decentralization and dispersal of the television industry into more numerous units, the separation of broadcasting from program production, and the further extension of educational programming will probably be sharply opposed by existing interests, if past American experience can serve as a relevant guide. Change will come by attrition and piecemeal reform, rather than by wholesale readjustment. Here, again, scientific and technological developments may become the handmaidens of constructive change. They may make possible, through home videotapes, home-operated lenses, closed-channel programming, far greater diversity than is today available, as well as more extensive exploitation of the audiovisual media by more institutions and organizations. Instead of limiting intellectual horizons, television could become a tool for expanding them. Cultural change in our society may also be spurred by the growing female rebellion, accelerated by education and new sexual mores. This massive entrance of women into the professions, into executive positions, and into politics is probably only a generation away, and there is already abundant evidence of mounting restlessness because of current inequalities of opportunity. Such increased feminine assertiveness could spill over into American society's cultural front, enhancing somewhat the general social interest in cultural growth and standards. Rational humanism. The technological thrust of the economic wealth of the United States now make it possible to give the concept of liberty and equality a broader meaning, going beyond the procedural and external to the personal and inner spheres of man's social existence. By focusing more deliberately on these qualitative aspects of life, America may avoid the depersonalizing dangers inherent in the self-generating but philosophically meaningless mechanization of environment, and build a social framework for a synthesis of man's external and inner dimensions. Such a synthesis may eventually result from the current intense conflict between the irrational personalism of the humanists and the impersonal rationality of the modernizers. The former group, source of much of the rhetoric of the literary community, the student activists, and the doctrinaire liberals, partakes of the tradition of skepticism and disbelief that played such a vital role in overthrowing the religious and philosophical hold of pre-industrial America on the values of industrial America. It seeks to fortify this tradition by a new emphasis on emotion and feeling. Given its Dadaist style and its Luddite-inspired historical posture, it is unlikely that this camp will long remain vital. The potential transformation of the new left into the violent left will certainly not enhance its appeal to the American public. The latter group, more typical of the new business executives, the governmental commercial establishment, and the scientific organization men, seeks to combine self-interest with a detached emphasis on rationalist innovation. Since it fails to provide a satisfactory emotional or philosophical rationale for either, it alienates the more idealistic young people. The clash between these two orientations is destructive and threatening to American liberal democracy. It fragments the remnants of the consensus of the industrial age and polarizes articulate public opinion. Yet it also holds the promise of a new perspective that is better suited to the needs of the emerging American society, since it moves beyond the increasingly irrelevant framework that now confines modern man's outlook. This new perspective involves growing recognition that man's propensity for scientific innovation cannot be restrained, that as long as man's mind functions, scientific innovation will be one of its expressions. But it also involves a heightened awareness that as long as man conceives of himself as a distinctive being, idealism will be the central mode of expressing his spirit. The imperative need for both innovation and idealism is thus stimulating a rationalist, humane outlook that is gradually supplanting both the liberal skepticism of some humanists and the conservative social indifference of some modernizers. The rational humanism is expressed in several ways. First, in an emerging international consciousness that makes so many Americans and American institutions go beyond purely nationalistic concerns and become deeply involved in global problems of human growth and nourishment, and is prompting in American youth such a constructive preoccupation with problems of ecology. Second, in a growing tendency, in spite of a still deeply ingrained anti-communism, to view international problems as human issues and not as political confrontations between good and evil. Third, in a strong public idealism that is free of utopian impatience and often intolerant desire to resolve all outstanding dilemmas immediately. In addition, it can also be seen, in fact, that Americans, instead of trying to flee the problems of science, are attempting to balance their fascination with science and their reliance on it as a tool for dealing with human problems by a more intense concern with the personal qualities of life and by a quest for more philosophical and religiously ecumenical definitions of human nature. This suggests the likelihood of a revival of religiosity, of a more personal, non-institutional nature. Finally, the emerging rational humanism is historically contingent in the sense that it does not involve, as was the case with 19th century ideology, universally prescriptive concepts of social organization, but stresses cultural and economic global diversity. In so doing, rational humanism is likely to be historically more relevant than was the case with earlier responses to social dilemmas. Unlike the industrial age, when complexity and historical discontinuity induced ideological flights of the mind into atavism or futuristic utopias, in the technotronic age, the greater availability of means permits the definition of more attainable ends, thus making for a less doctrinaire and a more effective relationship between what is and what ought to be. The great revolutions of the 19th and 20th centuries sought both liberty and equality. But even in the absence of racial conflict, it was found that the two were difficult to combine in an age in which the traditional institutions of a religious, aristocratic, and agricultural era were clashing with the effects of skeptical rationalism, legalistic democracy, nascent social consciousness, and the needs of a developing urban industrial society. In America, the linkage of liberty and equality was especially hindered by deeply embedded fundamentalist religious values that were reinforced by the ever-widening gap between the progressing white community and the artificially arrested black community. Inequality became a self-fulfilling prophecy, as well as an economic necessity to the industrial developing North. The positive potential of the Third American Revolution lies in its promise to link liberty with equality. This linkage is a process and will not be attained all at once. Indeed, during the next several decades, reversals and even increased tensions are to be expected. Nevertheless, though frequently obscured by passionate polemics, the emerging rational humanism is part of the cultural revolution that America has been experiencing. A cultural revolution more enduring and deeper than the one that initiated the term. Linked to political reform, the current cultural revolution could gradually enlarge the scope of personal freedom by increasing the sense of fulfillment of an unprecedented number of citizens, and give greater meaning to equality by making knowledge the basis for social and racial egalitarianism. It could create the preconditions for a socially creative and individually gratifying society that would inevitably have a constructive world role to play.